Don't believe the diplomatic pleasantries you're hearing from Washington. While State Department officials are smiling for cameras and talking about the unshakable U.S.-Japan alliance, their counterparts at the Treasury Department are staring at spreadsheets in absolute disbelief. On March 18, 2026, the Bank of Japan executed a currency intervention that wasn't just about stabilizing the yen. It was a $3 trillion Declaration of Independence that fundamentally restructures the architecture of American financial hegemony in Asia. And here's what almost nobody is discussing. This wasn't a sudden decision made in response to market volatility. This was the culmination of a 19-month strategic pivot that Washington either didn't see coming or chose to ignore until it was too late. I'm going to show you today, with hard numbers and verifiable data, why Japan's currency move represents the most significant fracture in the post-1945 alliance system since Nixon closed the gold window. More importantly, I'm going to reveal the economic mechanisms that made this inevitable, the specific dollar amounts that expose what's really happening, and why this development hands China exactly what it's been working toward for the past decade. Let's start with what actually happened, because the mainstream coverage got the story almost entirely wrong. On March 18th at 2:47 a.m. Eastern Time, the Bank of Japan intervened in currency markets with unprecedented scale and aggression. The official explanation was straightforward: stabilize the yen after it had weakened to 156 yen per dollar, its lowest level since 1990. Markets were told this was defensive action, temporary stabilization, business as usual for a central bank protecting its currency from speculative attacks. That narrative is sophisticated misdirection. According to data from the Bank for International Settlements, Japan didn't just intervene in the spot market where currencies trade for immediate delivery. They deployed $127 billion across forward contracts extending 18 months into the future, purchased yen-denominated bonds through offshore entities in Singapore and London, and simultaneously coordinated with the Ministry of Finance to restructure $86 billion in sovereign debt holdings. This wasn't currency stabilization. This was financial architecture reconstruction executed under the cover of routine monetary policy. Here's what makes this extraordinary. Japan holds approximately $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, making it the second largest foreign holder of American debt after China. For 35 years, that position has functioned as both economic necessity and geopolitical anchor. Japan needed a stable dollar to maintain export competitiveness. America needed Japanese capital inflows to finance deficit spending. This symbiotic relationship formed the financial spine of the Pacific Alliance structure. What happened on March 18th was Japan beginning to sever that spine. The Bank of Japan didn't just sell dollars to buy yen. According to Federal Reserve custody data released April 2nd, Japan reduced its Treasury holdings by $47, $3 billion in a single week. That represents the largest one-week Treasury sell-off by any foreign central bank in the history of the Federal Reserve's public reporting, which extends back to 1978. Let that sink in. Nearly 5 decades of data, and this event stands alone. But here's where the story gets truly revealing. That $47. $3 billion didn't return to yen-denominated assets exclusively. Financial flow analysis from the International Monetary Fund, published in their April Capital Flows report, shows that approximately $31 billion of Japan's dollar liquidation moved into gold, Chinese government bonds, and multilateral development bank securities denominated in special drawing rights. This is portfolio restructuring away from dollar dependence, executed with precision and scale that indicates months of planning. Think about what this means. Japan isn't defending the yen from weakness. Japan is repositioning its entire reserve structure to reduce vulnerability to American monetary policy decisions. When the Federal Reserve raises rates, it strengthens the dollar, which automatically weakens the yen, which increases import costs for Japanese consumers and businesses. For decades, Japan accepted this asymmetry as the price of alliance. That acceptance just ended. The economic mechanism here is critical to understand. Japan runs a trade surplus with the United States of approximately $65 billion annually. Those dollars historically flowed back into treasury purchases, completing a circular system where American consumers bought Japanese goods and Japanese institutions financed American government spending. This circle allowed the United States to maintain both trade deficits and fiscal deficits simultaneously, without triggering currency crises or inflation spirals. It was the financial equivalent of a perpetual motion machine, and it depended entirely on Japanese cooperation. On March 18th, Japan broke the circle. This didn't start in March 2026. It started in August 2024, and the evidence trail is hiding in plain sight across Japanese government documents, central bank policy statements, and bilateral trade negotiations that received minimal Western media coverage. On August 23, 2024, Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry published a report titled Economic Security and Supply Chain Resilience in the Indo-Pacific Context. Buried on page 147 of that 280-page document is a single sentence that should have set off alarm bells in Washington. Diversification of reserve asset composition and settlement currency options will be prioritized to ensure monetary policy autonomy in an environment of increasing great power competition. I've spent a decade analyzing diplomatic language, and that sentence is the bureaucratic equivalent of a declaration of war on the dollar system. Monetary policy autonomy means freedom from Federal Reserve decisions. However, diversification of reserve asset composition means selling treasuries. Settlement currency options means trading in yen, yuan, or digital alternatives instead of dollars. This wasn't subtle. This was a roadmap published 19 months before the March intervention. What followed that August 2024 document was a systematic sequence of financial infrastructure development that Western analysts dismissed as unrelated technical adjustments. In September 2024, the Bank of Japan and People's Bank of China expanded their bilateral currency swap line from $30 billion to $77 billion. Currency swap lines allow central banks to exchange currencies without going through dollar intermediation, effectively creating dollar bypass mechanisms for trade settlement. In November 2024, Japan joined the cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT for international transactions. The announcement received minimal coverage, characterized as routine expansion of payment system options. But according to analysis from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research organizations, this integration gave Japanese banks the technical capacity to settle up to 40% of bilateral trade with China without touching the dollar system. That percentage doesn't sound dramatic until you realize Japan-China bilateral trade exceeds $350 billion annually. 40% of $350 billion is $140 billion in transactions that no longer require dollar intermediation. In January 2025, Japan's Government Pension Investment Fund, which manages approximately $8 trillion in assets, making it the world's largest pension fund, announced portfolio rebalancing toward geographically diversified assets with reduced concentration risk. That's pension fund language for we're selling U.S. assets and buying everywhere else. According to their March 2026 quarterly report, dollar-denominated assets declined from 47% of the portfolio to 39% over 14 months. That's an $86 billion shift out of dollar assets, executed gradually enough to avoid triggering market panic, but decisively enough to signal strategic repositioning. And here's the mechanism that ties everything together. Throughout 2025, Japan negotiated bilateral trade agreements with Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines that included provisions for yen-denominated settlement of specific commodity categories. These weren't comprehensive currency agreements. They were surgical insertions of yen settlement into critical supply chains: rare earth elements from Vietnam, natural gas from Indonesia, semiconductors from Malaysia. According to Japan's Ministry of Finance data, yen-denominated trade settlement increased from 18% of total Japanese trade in January 2024 to 31% by December 2025. Consider the implications. For 80 years, the dollar has functioned as the dominant trade settlement currency because it offered liquidity, stability, and universal acceptance. But if Japan can negotiate bilateral arrangements that allow direct yen settlement, suddenly the dollar becomes optional rather than mandatory for entire categories of transaction. And if Japan can do this, so can every other major economy. The network effect that sustains dollar dominance begins to erode. This is exactly what happened to the British pound between 1945 and 1971. Britain didn't lose the pound's reserve currency status in a single dramatic crisis. It lost it because the world it had built outgrew the system it controlled. Trade patterns shifted, alternative mechanisms emerged, and gradually the pound became one option among many rather than the only option. The same logic applies here. China doesn't need to destroy the dollar system through confrontation. It just needs to build viable alternatives and wait for America's allies to start using them. Here's what triggered Japan's strategic pivot, and it's not what diplomatic analysts expected. It wasn't territorial disputes over the Senkaku Islands. It wasn't Chinese military modernization in the South China Sea. It wasn't even concerns about American commitment to alliance obligations. It was cost asymmetry in monetary policy transmission that made dollar dependence economically unsustainable. Let me explain the mechanism with specific numbers because this is where theory becomes material reality. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 25% in March 2022 to 5% by July 2023, that aggressive tightening cycle strengthened the dollar against virtually every major currency. The yen depreciated from 115 per dollar in January 2022 to 151 per dollar by November 2023. That 31% depreciation created immediate consequences for Japan's import-dependent economy. Japan imports approximately 94% of its energy needs. According to Ministry of Finance trade statistics, Japan spent $187 billion on energy imports in 2023, up from $127 billion in 2021. That $60 billion increase wasn't primarily driven by higher oil prices, which actually declined slightly over that period. It was driven by yen weakness, making dollar-denominated energy purchases more expensive. Every percentage point of yen depreciation against the dollar added approximately $1. $8 billion to Japan's annual energy import bill. But here's where it becomes truly painful. Japan's households and businesses absorbed that $60 billion cost increase through higher electricity prices, higher gasoline prices, and higher costs for any product requiring energy-intensive manufacturing. According to data from Japan's Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, real household income declined 7% between January 2022 and December 2023 after adjusting for inflation. That's the steepest two-year decline since the oil shocks of the 1970s. Now contrast Japan's experience with China's response to the same global monetary environment. When the Federal Reserve raised rates aggressively, China allowed controlled yuan depreciation, but simultaneously deployed capital controls and strategic subsidy programs to insulate domestic consumers from import cost increases. According to World Bank data, Chinese real household income increased 2% over the same period when Japanese income declined 7%. That's an 8 percentage point gap in living standards trajectory, created entirely by monetary policy flexibility that China possessed and Japan lacked. Think about what this means for Japanese policymakers. They're watching Chinese living standards improve while Japanese living standards decline, not because of productivity differences or innovation gaps, but because China maintains monetary policy autonomy and Japan has subordinated its monetary policy to Federal Reserve decisions through the dollar peg maintenance system. This is unsustainable politically. No democracy can accept perpetual living standard decline to maintain alliance financial architecture. The breaking point came in January 2026, when the Federal Reserve signaled potential for additional rate increases, despite clear evidence of Japanese economic stress. According to meeting minutes from the Bank of Japan's January 28th policy meeting, obtained through Japan's disclosure laws, Governor Ueda explicitly stated that continued subordination of domestic monetary policy objectives to external exchange rate, stability considerations, risks, structural economic damage, and political sustainability of current policy frameworks. That's central banker language for, "We can't keep doing this." And here's the dollar amount that made the decision inevitable. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in January 2026 estimated that maintaining the yen's dollar peg through continued large-scale treasury purchases would cost Japan's economy approximately $340 billion in cumulative lost GDP growth over the subsequent 5 years. That's larger than Sweden's entire annual economic output. That's the cost of alliance financial architecture. Japan looked at that number and decided the price was too high. But there's another dimension to this story that operates beneath the currency mechanics, and it involves the industry that will define 21st century economic competitiveness: advanced semiconductors. This is where American strategic overreach collided with Japanese economic interests and produced the final catalyst for currency policy independence. In October 2022, the United States implemented the most aggressive semiconductor export controls in the history of American technology policy. The CHIPS and Science Act wasn't just about restricting Chinese access to advanced chips. It included provisions requiring any company receiving U.S. subsidies to limit investment in Chinese semiconductor facilities, refrain from technology sharing arrangements, and comply with expansive definitions of national security that gave Washington veto power over business decisions. For Japan's semiconductor industry, this created an impossible situation. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association, Japanese companies generate approximately $73 billion in annual revenue from the Chinese market, representing 31% of total industry revenue. Tokyo Electron, Japan's largest semiconductor equipment manufacturer, derives 47% of its revenue from Chinese customers. Companies like Renesas, Advantest, and Screen Holdings face similar exposure levels. The American position was clear: choose the alliance or choose the Chinese market. You cannot have both. For Japanese executives and government officials, this ultimatum looked less like alliance solidarity and more like economic coercion, disguised as security cooperation. Because here's what the numbers reveal. Implementing full compliance with American semiconductor restrictions would cost Japanese companies an estimated $280 billion in lost revenue over a decade, according to analysis from Tokyo-based Mizuho Research Institute. Now, remember that $340 billion cost of maintaining dollar dependence I mentioned earlier. Add the $280 billion cost of semiconductor compliance. You're looking at $620 billion in cumulative economic damage over the next decade, imposed by alliance obligations rather than Chinese aggression. That's the entire annual GDP of Poland. That's what alliance architecture costs when the hegemon prioritizes its zero-sum competition with China over the economic interests of its partners. Japan responded with strategic ambiguity wrapped in diplomatic politeness. They publicly supported the CHIPS Act while privately negotiating exemptions, carve-outs, and definitional flexibility that preserved access to Chinese markets. But this created perpetual uncertainty for Japanese companies trying to plan investments, structure supply chains, and forecast revenue. By late 2025, this uncertainty translated directly into stalled projects and delayed expansions worth tens of billions in potential economic activity. The currency intervention in March 2026 didn't happen in isolation from semiconductor tensions. It happened because Japanese policymakers concluded that they needed monetary policy autonomy to buffer the economic costs of navigating between American demands and Chinese economic reality. If Washington was going to impose $280 billion in semiconductor compliance costs, Tokyo would at least ensure it maintained the monetary policy flexibility to cushion the impact. I've seen this movie before. Not with Japan and America, but with France and America in the 1960s. And the parallels are unsettling for anyone who understands how empires lose financial dominance. In 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle announced that France would begin converting dollar reserves into gold, challenging the Bretton Woods system that positioned the dollar as the anchor of global finance. De Gaulle's critique was straightforward. The United States was exploiting its reserve currency position to run perpetual trade deficits, export inflation, and finance foreign military operations without fiscal constraint. France demanded gold redemption rather than continuing to accumulate dollars that steadily lost purchasing power. The mechanism de Gaulle identified is precisely the mechanism Japan is now confronting. When a country holds reserves in another nation's currency, it effectively extends credit to that nation. The reserve currency issuer can spend beyond its means because foreign central banks buy its debt. This creates what economists call exorbitant privilege, the ability to finance deficits at below-market rates because demand for your currency as a reserve asset exceeds demand based solely on trade or investment fundamentals. For decades after World War II, this privilege sustained American global power. The United States could simultaneously maintain a vast military presence, run trade deficits, and finance social programs without facing the currency crises that would have devastated any other nation attempting the same fiscal trajectory. Foreign central banks, including Japan's, recycled their trade surpluses into treasury purchases, creating a closed loop that appeared perpetually sustainable. But de Gaulle recognized the asymmetry. France accumulated dollars through trade surpluses, then watched the United States inflate away the real value of those holdings through expansionary monetary policy. France was effectively subsidizing American consumption while bearing the inflation risk. De Gaulle's gold conversions were an attempt to discipline American monetary policy by demanding real assets rather than accepting perpetually depreciating paper. The United States responded to de Gaulle's challenge by abandoning gold convertibility entirely in 1971, transforming the dollar from a gold-backed currency to a pure fiat system backed only by faith in American institutions and the inertia of existing financial architecture. That move worked because no alternative reserve system existed that offered comparable scale, liquidity, and stability. But here's what's different in 2026. Alternatives now exist that didn't exist in 1971. China's cross-border interbank payment system provides dollar-independent transaction settlement. Bilateral currency swap lines allow direct exchange without dollar intermediation. Digital central bank currencies offer programmable money that bypasses the correspondent banking system. And most critically, China's economy is large enough and sophisticated enough to anchor a regional trade and financial system that doesn't require dollar participation. Japan's March 18th intervention is the 2026 equivalent of de Gaulle's gold conversions. It's not an attack on the dollar system. It's a declaration that the costs of participation now exceed the benefits, and alternatives exist that reduce those costs. Japan isn't trying to destroy dollar dominance. Japan is simply declining to continue subsidizing it. And here's what should terrify strategic planners in Washington. Japan is supposed to be the most loyal American ally in Asia. If Tokyo is diversifying away from dollars, restructuring reserves, and building dollar bypass mechanisms, what are other American partners doing in private? South Korea holds $460 billion in reserves, predominantly dollars. Taiwan holds $575 billion. Saudi Arabia holds $440 billion. If these countries follow Japan's playbook even partially, the dollar's reserve currency status faces death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single dramatic crisis. Now we need to talk about the strategic beneficiary of this entire sequence, because regardless of what triggered Japan's currency move, there's only one major power whose position strengthens as a result: China. Every step Japan takes toward monetary policy autonomy, every bilateral trade agreement denominated in yen, every dollar liquidated from reserves and redirected to multilateral alternatives, all of it advances China's decade-long project to create a post-dollar financial architecture for Asia. China doesn't need to attack the dollar directly. It just needs to provide infrastructure and incentives that make dollar alternatives viable, then watch as American policies drive partners toward those alternatives. Consider what China has built over the past decade with specific attention to the dollar amounts involved. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, founded in 2015 with Chinese leadership, now has 109 member countries and has approved $53 billion in financing for infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative has channeled more than $1 trillion into infrastructure development that physically connects Chinese industry to markets across Eurasia. The cross-border interbank payment system processes approximately $12 trillion in annual transactions, growing at 47% annually. These aren't isolated projects. They're interconnected elements of a parallel financial system that offers viable alternatives to dollar-dominated institutions. And here's the critical mechanism. China doesn't need to convince every country to abandon the dollar completely. It just needs to convince them to use dollar alternatives for a growing share of transactions. Even if only 20 to 30% of global trade shifts to yuan or other currency settlement, that represents trillions of dollars in reduced demand for treasuries, which translates directly to higher borrowing costs for the United States government. Japan's currency intervention accelerates this process by validating the decision to diversify away from dollars. When the second largest holder of treasuries publicly restructures its reserves, that sends a signal to every other central bank that dollar concentration represents unrewarded risk. According to game theory research published by economists at Yale University in 2024, reserve currency transitions exhibit network effects where early movers face high costs, but late movers face even higher costs of remaining in the declining currency. Japan's move potentially triggers a coordination cascade where other central banks accelerate their own diversification to avoid being the last holders of an eroding reserve asset. And here's the specific dollar impact. If foreign central banks collectively reduce treasury holdings by just 10% over the next 3 years, that represents approximately $750 billion in reduced demand for U.S. government debt. Attractive.